So hi friends, welcome to a new video. Occasionally on my intros here I say, on this channel I sew vintage fashion and hopefully soon some historical sewing as well. And like most humans this time of year, I am thinking about what I want to do next year, what I would like to accomplish and my goals. And so I am hoping to turn that hopefully into actually sewing some historical garments. So I have Vazi here from V.Birchwood to answer some of my questions about just how to get started with historical sewing and history bounding. So hi Vazi, welcome to my channel. When I found your channel, I was just blown away by the fact that you 100% hand sew all your historical garments, as well as the fact that you have only been sewing for less than 2 years. What a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Drew. It's really a pleasure to be here with you as well.
Oh, and thank you in advance for editing this video. You did agree to that.
My pleasure. Yeah, I like editing, so I'm happy to be able to help.
Yes, and my viewers know I do not like the editing process, so very happy you agreed to do that for us today. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and your channel and how you got started with historical sewing.
So the way I got started with historical sewing is that basically I started by wearing historical fashion, and that was almost, I think, 3 years ago now. So that's when I first began buying different garments that are historical, and I started to implement them into my day-to-day wardrobe. Some of those things were also historically inspired, so not everything at that time was completely historical. And still to this day, I wear a lot of historically inspired things too, though I would say they lean more historical fashion than history bounding. There are a lot of reasons why I started wearing historical fashion day to day, one of them being sustainability, because that's something that really inspires me and is really important to me. And not every historical garment is going to be more sustainable necessarily, but I really enjoyed the idea of being able to know where my fashion came from and being so deeply involved in what I was making. So I got pretty tired of wearing kind of ill-fitting secondhand historical garments from other creators. So I decided I wanted to start sewing them myself. So I began sewing in August of, I believe, 2020. For me, I'm really scared of sewing machines. And so because of that, I knew I wanted to hand sew from the very beginning. And I know that that's not for everybody, and it's definitely a little bit crazy at times, and you have to be very patient, but it's what I personally wanted to do for myself, and that's ultimately how my journey began, was enjoying wearing it, and then eventually that transformed into sewing it.
Well, you're doing amazing. I have been following your journey from the beginning, and it has been amazing just to see your growth, see the things that you create. To watch you become more comfortable on camera has been amazing. I'm hoping that that can wear off on me. I do feel like I'm getting there. If you go back to like some of the earlier content to now, I definitely feel more like myself on camera. And I definitely see more of you coming through as well. And that's been a pleasure to watch. Sustainability is something that I think we all need to become more aware of. I'm in the process of getting there myself. I used to do these videos here on my channel where I would show these hauls of all the sewing supplies and fabrics I was buying every month. And I've stopped doing that because I just started to look around my sewing room like, you know, this is unnecessary. And so I'm becoming more aware of buying fabric secondhand and making do with what I have. And so to see someone represent sustainability so well, that's awesome too.
Thank you. And I think just reconnecting with where the things that we use day to day come from, I kind of see it as being akin to making your own furniture and then using that furniture every day. It's a really meditative and kind of a beautiful practice that I think we've gotten really far from in today's Western world, because things are really easy to buy, and so obviously not a lot of us go through the painstaking time it takes to make something by hand. And I think that connecting back with that is a really beautiful experience, and it's one that I personally really enjoy in my own life. So it's something that I decided to implement on a more regular basis.
Yes, and I think that ties into the vintage sewing and vintage lifestyle as well. You know, in modern times, you go into someone's closet and they have just 1,000 pieces, 50 skirts and all of this stuff. And I think with vintage sewing and dressing vintage, you curate more of a wardrobe where you have a few blouses and a few skirts, but they all sort of coordinate and go together well, where you don't necessarily have 50 blouses or dresses or whatever. It's more just cohesive, so you need less and you wear the things that you have more, and I think that builds an appreciation for them.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. And I think too, it actually makes getting dressed a lot more straightforward because you don't have to think, okay, how am I going to pair this with this? And you can also do things like creating capsule wardrobes around your vintage or historical pieces.
So, where do you think someone like me who is completely new to historical sewing has no idea where to begin? Where should I start?
Where I would recommend starting is by deciding on your era. So there's probably going to be a lot of eras that you're interested in. And that's very understandable. If we look at people historically, they would have just dressed whatever was that year of fashion. There wasn't enough options like we have today. So for them, it was just clothing. For us, now that we have so much choice, it's a beautiful thing, but it's also kind of an overwhelming thing. So it's good to kind of go, okay, I really like, I don't know, 1890s, but, you know, for right now, I'm gonna start with 1730s. I'm just picking random years. But just deciding on a decade or just a period of time that has a concrete silhouette that you can then work with. And then also learning the basic hand stitches that you would need to know, because even if you choose to sew historical clothing with a machine, there's a good chance that there's some things you'll have to finish by hand. And also things like basting are really useful to do by hand. I actually have a video where I teach you 7 essential historical hand sewing stitches. It's kind of old now because I think I started my channel like in January 2021, and this video is from maybe March, so it's a little bit old compared to like my newer content, and I'm a little bit like awkward in it, I think, but the information is still very, I think, applicable and useful.
That brings me to my next question. What are some good resources for research? I have found that I have kind of narrowed down the silhouettes that I like, and I'm able to identify them as being 1890s, 1860s. I'm in that region, and so it's been hard for me to do the research on the undergarments and making sure, like, I don't want to have on an 1890s dress with 1820s undergarments or whatever. So do you have any resources you would recommend for research?
So my best recommendation is to use something like LACMA or the Met, because they just have endless extant examples and very high quality photographs of all of these different periods. So what you can do is just type in, I don't know, corset or dress or some basic keyword, and then basically change the date. So I think they have it by hundreds of years. So they have like block periods that you can choose, and then you'll get a big pop-up of all these different outfits from those time periods, basically. So then I would kind of see what catches your eye, and there's a good chance if you like, I don't know, 1860s to 1890s, you're probably going to choose something anyways that's kind of from that era, because your eye is drawn to it and like your mind is drawn to it. It's kind of a fun game to play, actually, like guess the era, because you start to notice patterns like, oh, maybe I really do like this era because I keep enjoying garments from this period. The way I would say with undergarments, it's fairly straightforward. I would say that generally it always consists of a shift or chemise, stockings, and a corset or some type of corsetry, and then padding. There's almost always going to be those elements in at least a mid to late Victorian outfit. So that kind of helps get you going, because then you can type in 1860s padding or 1860s chemise, and then you'll be able to find on Google a number of options for that time period. One of the good things too about corsetry is that you don't always have to wear a corset from the same period, especially not for mid to late Victorian, because they're relatively similar garments. They're not like identical or anything, but with all your other clothing on, they still create a similar silhouette. It's not like with Edwardian where you're already getting a totally different look, and then you need a new corset.
So my next question is there a certain era you think would be easier, or are there some that you think would be more difficult?
So definitely Regency and any type of Victorian workwear is pretty straightforward. I started with a Regency garment, but eventually I transitioned into Georgian and then into Victorian as well, because that's really what I wanted to be sewing. I just wanted to make something to be able to get the experience and the practice a little bit. I would say the hardest things to sew are definitely tailored garments, because tailoring is kind of a unique skill that involves a lot of extra steps that I would say typical garments don't require. And so because of that, it's almost like its own entity in a sense. There's like dressmaking and then there's tailoring too. Tailoring is best kept once you kind of are more familiar with the fabrics. I think too, knowing how to pick your battles with this as well is really important. I don't find it to be time or financially valuable for me to sew undergarments. So because of that, I buy them. Because hand sewing undergarments is its own ball game. Undergarments are kind of complicated sometimes and they require a lot more work than we think they do. So because of that, I buy undergarments from other creators and then I focus on sewing the garments that I'm going to get a lot of use out of wearing on a day-to-day basis. So the things that probably would be more expensive as well to buy, just kind of thinking about that when you're starting to sew too, deciding on what's going to be both time and financially viable for you to start with.
That makes sense. So another question is this going to be expensive? And are there ways that I can save money?
It's definitely not a cheap hobby, but it doesn't have to cost you an arm and a leg, basically. There are definitely ways to save money, one of them being finding either thrifted fabric or dead stock fabric is really good. I know that in the US there's a store called Fabric Mart. And then in the UK, I use a site called Ammo Threads because I live in the UK, so I'm not really super familiar with the market in the US, but from what I know, Fabric Mart is really good. And if you just search on Google dead stock fabric and then your country, there should hopefully be some options. Another place that I found to be really good for fabric deals is actually Facebook Marketplace, because sometimes people are doing a de-stash because maybe they are not sewing anymore, or maybe they're just not interested in the hobby, or maybe they need the money, who knows. So because of that, they'll often sell a big lot of their fabric, and then you could maybe be the lucky person to buy that lot.
Oh, what a great resource. See, I would have never thought of that. That's awesome. So Fabric Mart has a sale 4 to 6 times a year, where there's $3, $4, and $5 a yard fabrics, and so that is usually when I'll stock up.
I think too, not being afraid to piece, because piecing is very period. You hear this a lot in the historical fashion community. Historically, garments were really imperfect. If you look at them, they're kind of like so roughly made in certain parts, and it really shows us that nobody has ever been perfect. Even the experts 200 years ago or 100 years ago were not perfect. I think it's not being afraid to get creative with how you're utilizing your fabric, because that can save you a lot. You can use the selve edges a lot, and that's also very historically accurate, or, you know, accurate. We'll get into that later, why I put air quotes around that, but.
I would love to hear your thoughts on historical accuracy, as well as historical practice.
I put air quotes around historically accurate because I believe in more so historical adequacy. I think that we use the term historically accurate because it's the vernacular of the historical fashion world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people mean fully accurate. So we are very limited in our understanding of history. We only understand history as much as we have evidence for it, but the reality is that evidence is always going to be limited because not everything survives over time. And so because of that, a lot of the extants we have in museums are typically ones from either wealthier individuals that didn't get worn a lot, or they're just ones that didn't get worn because they were for maybe teenagers who then grew out of them very quickly. So because of that, we're perceiving that everybody wore expensive and very small clothing, which is not the truth. There were people in all shapes and sizes during that time historically, just like now. And not everybody was wealthy. In fact, the majority of people were not wealthy. Most people couldn't afford to buy these beautiful garments. But we're very much biased. We have what we call it survivor's bias, the bias of whatever's survived through history. So that's what we're thinking is history. And then the other thing we have are paintings and photos. Well, paintings are up to an artist's interpretations, and only the wealthiest individuals could have afforded to get a painting done. And they would have worn their nicest outfit as well. And then photos, it was also really expensive for a long time to get your photo taken, and again, they would have worn their nicest outfit, and it might have even been borrowed from somebody else. It might not even have been their outfit. So because of that, I don't think accuracy is really that accurate. I think it's more adequacy, because we're all just doing the best with the knowledge that we have. And I think that's perfectly okay. We're kind of all just interpreting history and seeing what it means to us. In that sense, it shouldn't be something that you get too hung up on, especially not in the beginning, because this is supposed to be fun and enjoyable. And the more pressure you put on yourself and the less kind you are to yourself throughout this process, you're not going to enjoy your hobby. And that defeats the purpose of sewing in the first place, is we're supposed to love it. So because of that, I think everybody should just sew as accurate or as inaccurate as they want to. I think the exception to this would be for educational purposes. So if it's for museum reproductions or something, then of course it needs to be as accurate as possible, because it's for a museum to educate people about the original clothing. So that makes sense. But when it comes to your own personal sewing and your own journey, I just think people need to do whatever makes them feel happiest, especially if it's not hurting anybody else.
And you heard that here, folks, because we all know, and here lately especially, our community has taken on a little bit of snobbish ways at times, and for beginners and for people who can't, like me, who can't afford 20 yards of the finest silk, sometimes it puts you off from wanting to get started. And I think the best thing we can all do is just get started. Sew that thing, make that thing, and make it to the best of your ability.
Yeah, I think just about, doing the best that we can do and doing ultimately what we're proud of, and being nice to ourselves and understanding that there is never going to be perfection, and also that it doesn't have to be fast either. I think slowing down with your sewing is so important. Sometimes we see these videos on the internet of people making garments, and because they're so sped up, we think to ourselves on some subconscious level that, oh, I have to make this really quickly. But the reality is that person could have been working on that garment for months, and we only get to see what's the final product. So because of that, our brain perceives it differently. But I guess just remembering to slow down and remembering that imperfection is normal and it's healthy.
That's so very insightful, Bazi. So very insightful. And I totally agree with that. And I think slowing down is a big part of this hobby. It's supposed to be one of the key reasons why we do it, and why, especially, with the past 2 years, everything, it was necessary to slow down and do those slow things that feel good to you. So I definitely agree with that. And I was gonna ask you about historical practice, but I'm sure you're probably an advocate for that because you're hand sewing everything.
I do this for myself personally, and it's my own thing that I love to do, and I love to share it with people, but I never think that anybody should do anything that they're not comfortable with or that they don't enjoy doing, because that's ultimately what matters the most. It's about appreciating the small steps and getting to the final garment, and then being able to really appreciate the hard work you put into the final thing, which is a nice moment to reflect on what you did and kind of decide on like what you could do better, and also what you did really well. And I think it's a journey of reflection and considering just the beautiful thing that you just made with your own hands. I mean, that is so phenomenal that we're able to make things in this world with our hands. I think that's such a spectacular part of being a human.
For sure. And speaking on reflection, I would love to hear, what is your very favorite thing you've made? And I would also like to hear a little bit about some positive things from your sewing experience, as well as your time here on YouTube.
So my favorite thing I've made is an 1890 to 91 walking suit. I think it's my favorite, not because the fit is perfect or anything, but because of the fact that it took me 400 hours to hand sew it. Wow. So that just makes me automatically appreciate the garment so much, because I put so much work and time into it. I think what was incredible with this walking suit is it's in the original size of the original extant. So it's based off a real extant from Patterns of Fashion 2. And this was a woman that lived during, I guess, 1890 to 91. And it's the exact same size as her walking suit. So I didn't modify the pattern, except I shortened the skirt a tiny bit just for personal preference, but it would have fit me had I not shortened it. So yeah, when I tried on the mock-up, it was just this really eerie experience, because it automatically dawned on me that this woman would have been my same size. And I also have very unstandard measurements. So I have like a really short waist, and I have to always take in the bust and things like that. I wasn't expecting it to fit, but then it did fit incredibly well, to the point where I didn't have to modify it. That's part of why that garment is my favorite, is because of the backstory behind it. The fact that I used, as good as to my knowledge as possible, the techniques that Janet Arnold makes notes about in the actual book as well. So those would have been the techniques that would have been used. Of course, it was all hand sewn too, which is something else that I feel really like it was a big accomplishment, and just that big block of time it took. And then finally, also, it's something that I like to wear a lot. So I get a lot of use out of the garment, which is something that I think takes it to another level, because I get to really appreciate every one of my garments for a really long time, and hopefully repair them and alter them as I change in my life, and just continue to kind of have them live as a part of my life as well.
That's so awesome.
Thank you. And with regards to YouTube, I mean, obviously my channel is really new.
Your channel is definitely blowing up. It's amazing. I think your love for what you're doing comes through, and it's so authentic. And so even for me, like finding your channel and seeing your videos, I was just like, I can do this too. And I can do both. I can do vintage and I can do historical. And it just made me aware of just some of the really common threads in the two.
Thank you so much. And that's what I want to do with my channel, is create a safe space for everybody to be able to learn that it's okay to express themselves however they want to, and to be able to just create a really loving and comforting environment for people where they can see the passion of another human being. I've done creative things since I was a kid, and because of that, I think I always just wanted to show what it's like to wear walking art, because I love the philosophy of wearing art. I think sometimes with art, we tuck it away like a nice vase in a house. You know, we're afraid of touching it, we're afraid of breaking it. But I want to do the opposite. I really believe that the things that are nice in our lives, we should get use out of them. And so I really want to encourage that on my channel. And don't be afraid to use the nice things that you make for yourself, and treat yourself, really. Enjoy the things that you've put hard work into. That's always just been my goal, and I think that the outpouring of the love and beautiful compliments and comments that I've gotten over the last, I don't know, 10 months, 11 months now, are really amazing, and they're really what keep me going, and just knowing that I'm making an impact on some community or some individuals. Of course you get, you know, some negative comments, but ultimately I just have try to have compassion with those people, or just ignore them if it's like a lost cause, because some people you can't argue with them no matter what you try. No matter how compassionate and nice you are to them, they won't get it, which is okay. There is always going to be someone that disapproves, no matter what you do in life. YouTube is no different. That doesn't stop me from wanting to make content for people and wanting to make an impact, and it really gives my life so much purpose. And I think that that's ultimately why I keep going, even though I work a full-time job on top of doing YouTube full-time. It's really just my passion for it. And I think that passion comes out in so many different ways.
I think the key takeaway here for me is what, you just said about feeling free to express yourself in what feels good and authentic to you. My viewers know that I have struggled with wanting to dress vintage full-time, and I am finally coming out of my shell with that and being okay with that, okay with the stares and the people not understanding. But personal style is very personal, and it's a personal journey. And so definitely express yourself how you see fit. If you're not hurting anybody, live your life with what feels good and authentic to you. And when starting, whether your historical sewing journey or your vintage sewing journey, or any sewing journey, any artistic endeavor, do what feels good and what feels authentic, and it will definitely be worth the 400 hours that you put in. You definitely get out what you put in. And so I do appreciate you for saying that, and I hope, same as you, that by being able to put myself out here like this and be vulnerable in this way, that I can help people get started on their journey, whatever that is. I'm gonna get started this year on my historical sewing journey. So thank you, and thank you for all the content that you put out. It's definitely helpful. There will be links down below of all of my favorite of Vazi's videos. Go check out her channel, V.Birchwood. There's a lot of great resources and motivation and inspiration and fun times, like watching her wash her hair with egg. That was just so fun for me. I was like, I literally have zero desire to do this, but watching you do it is enjoyable. And so That was great.
Thank you so much, Drew, for having me, and I'm really glad that you're making the leap to wear what you believe is your most authentic self-expression, because it takes courage sometimes, but it's a much more fulfilling life to wear things that bring you joy and just to do things in life that bring you joy too. I think you're offering so much invaluable resources to everybody here on your channel, and I'm really grateful for you for sharing all this information with people too.
Thank you for being here. It really meant a lot, and it was fun. It was fun chatting with you and getting to know you better.
Thanks so much for having me, Drew, and I hope to collaborate again in the future.